Great. Okay, hopefully that's the glitch of the day. So the members who are present at the table have introduced themselves. I think everyone on Zoom knows who they are. So we'll continue with introductions, starting with David Mandel.
Good morning. It's good to be with you all. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. My name is David Mandel. I'm a professor of psychiatry at the University of Pennsylvania.
Dr. Zach Williams.
Hi, everyone. My name is Zach Williams. I'm a psychiatry resident at UCLA, as well as an autistic self-advocate.
Matt State.
Hi, good morning. I'm Matt State. I am a child psychiatrist, chair of the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at UCSF, and the scientific director of Aligning Research to Impact Autism.
And Dr. Kristen Soul.
Good morning. I'm Kristen Soul. I'm a pediatrician specializing in development and behavior, here representing the American Academy of Pediatrics as an executive member of the Council on Children with Disabilities.
And we're still waiting for Dr. Josh Gordon, the past chair of the I-ACC. He's in the process of dialing in.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
It says he sent an email saying he couldn't join the Zoom thing. It's working now. Okay.
Oh, hopefully he will pop up shortly. All right, well, we'll get started. The Independent Autism Coordinating Committee's goal is to develop a coordinated scientific strategic plan for autism research. Recent events have made this a pivotal moment to strengthen coordination among non-governmental groups, including scientists and stakeholders with scientific expertise. The new independent consortium will promote alignment and help to sustain autism research progress. In 2006, Congress passed the Combating Autism Act, which created an interagency autism coordinating committee. The law requires the I-ACC to develop an annual strategic plan for autism research and to submit an annual summary of scientific advances to Congress. For the past 20 years, the I-ACC has fulfilled this role. Earlier this year, HHS Secretary Kennedy announced 21 new I-ACC members, many of whom propound the false narrative that childhood vaccines cause autism. Several of the new members have promoted non-evidence-based, often dangerous treatments for autism, and none have served on the I-ACC before. In contrast, our new Independent Autism Coordinating Committee has brought together accomplished scientific experts and stakeholders with extensive research experience, many of whom have served on and even chaired the I-ACC. And our goal is to accelerate scientific discovery, improve care, and positively impact the lives of people with autism. We will create a research agenda for autism that reflects the rapid progress and growing promise of autism science. And we will report annually on the key advances in autism research across the translational continuum, including basic research on genes and cells, environmental causes, early detection, therapeutics, and services. The group will also respond quickly to any recommendations made by the federal I-ACC that are not supported by science. Surprisingly, none of the non-governmental research funders were included in the new federal I-ACC, despite the fact that one of the I-ACC's goals is to create a public-private partnership for research funding. This is also despite the fact that the fastest growing segment of autism funding is non-governmental groups. Autism research funding overall has grown approximately 36% since 2020, with private funding driving the vast majority of growth. In 2020, which unfortunately is the last year for which we have data from the I-ACC on funding, a total of $419 million was devoted to autism research. And our estimate for 2025 is $568 million, with non-governmental funding of 180%.
Sorry, 180%.
Non-governmental.
Can you go back to that slide?
Mm-hmm. I might be answering your question in the next slide.
2020.
With the percent change. There are no data from I-ACC past 2020.
That's correct. The data The last time the IAC reported funding data was 2020.
That's reported in 2024.
Yes, but it's for funding in 2020.
Right, so where are these numbers?
The 2025 numbers come from public sources. Announcements by organizations as to their funding.
Like their annual reports.
Yes. So here's some more information on the breakdown of the funding. Which is not advancing. Oh, yours
Oh,
advanced.
good, that's fine. Look at you.
So on this slide, you can see governmental funding in blue and non-government in green. Non-government, we now estimate, is making up 40% of overall funding in 2025. This is due to the Simons Foundation increasing its funding, ARIA entering the picture and announcing an initial $45 million in grants. Based on recent announcements, we anticipate that number will only go up in 2026. The Marcus Foundation pledging $22 million for research, and the Nancy Lori Marks Foundation pledging an additional $50 million. So non-governmental funding has gone from 17.5% in 2020 to approximately 40% of autism research funding in 2025. And again, we anticipate that number will only go up in 2026. And that is one of the key reasons why we are here, to ensure that there is collaboration and coordination between these groups, as well as other non-governmental research funders like the Autism Science Foundation and the Organization for Autism Research and others, and that we work together to establish a research roadmap that ultimately benefits people with autism and their families. All of the current members of the committee have submitted disclosures similar to the ones the federal IAC uses. These disclosures were reviewed by an independent law firm that has knowledge of these issues, Schultz Nonprofit Law in Wisconsin. The firm reviewed all of the disclosures and issued a determination letter that is currently posted on the website. I'm going to read just a small portion. So in their determination letter, they report no member would be disqualified under the federal criminal financial conflict of interest statute. But they did say that based on their review of current members' disclosure firms, they noted that members have significant national expertise and connections within the field of autism research and advocacy, and that such expertise is relevant to the purpose of the Independent Autism Coordinating Committee and does not create an impermissible conflict. Instead, it creates obligations to disclose on an issue-by-issue basis and possibly recuse themselves from voting or participating in discussions consistent with the Independent Autism Coordinating Committee's conflict of interest policy. And that conflict of interest policy is also posted on the website. So specifically, they gave two examples of narrow instances where members might need to recuse themselves. The first involved Dr. Matt State, who has an equity interest as the founder of a company that focuses on using protein interaction data to develop therapeutics. And they determined that while this does not present a conflict in the primary function, he would need to recuse himself from any discussion on use to funding to such therapies. And then finally, they determined that Dr. Tom Insel, who's the founder of Gray Matter, but does not have an equity interest in that company, nor involved in the company's autism-related investments. And similar to Dr. State, while the company's investments currently do not create a conflict of interest because of his affiliation, he would need to recuse himself from discussions where Gray Matter could directly benefit with respect to their autism investments. So overall, the determination was that no members had a conflict that would make their participation a violation of conflict of interest. So we are eager to hear input from other stakeholders, and we look forward to public comment later this afternoon. Already, we have received many comments about adding additional members to this committee to meet the criteria outlined in the CARES Act, and we will be responsive to that feedback. Later today, the committee will discuss adding additional committee members as well as discussing the other public comments. And all of the written comments that the committee has received have been shared with all committee members, and they are also posted on the website. I want to just remind people who are watching on the Zoom that you can continue to submit written comments, and they will be distributed to committee members after today's meeting. And after today's meeting, they will also be posted on the website. So at this point, I'd like to hand the floor to Dr. Helen Tager-Flusberg, the founder of the Coalition for Autism Scientists. There, we get your slides.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I'm going to talk a little bit about the impact of everything that has been happening over the past year on autism science. Not getting this to work.
I just got another email from Josh. We're dealing with it. There you go.
No, that's gone too far ahead. It's not, the timing is off. Okay, so we formed the Coalition of Autism Science almost a year ago, mostly because we were seriously concerned about the future of autism science that seemed to be in jeopardy given the enormous changes that were happening at the federal government. Currently, we have 340 members. And what we do is we coordinate information, we issue statements to correct the scientific record. We review and monitor the impact on grant funding and the impact on researchers in particular. And we are monitoring all the changes that are taking place at NIH, CDC, the I-ACC, and so forth. And we are truly pleased to be part of, part of this new independent ACC so that we can focus on constructive plans for the future of autism science. I will quickly review some of the negative impacts on autism science. There's been a drastic cut in the number of scientists and program staff who are at the NIH and CDC that focus on autism programs.
Was that a Doge impact?
There was Doge and beyond that, drastic cuts. Termination of autism-related grants at the NIH, loss of funding, particularly training grants and in funding for early career scientists.
So is there still an office of autism science at the NIH?
Autism science, do you mean
It was
do
a-
the NIH directors convene?
So there was
Which is-
there was an office that
Autism
managed the
Research
NIH.
Coordination.
Yes, does that exist?
Yes. That does exist. There's been no communication from them for over a year. I'm a former I-ACC member. We haven't heard anything from them for more than a year. There have been radical changes in the priorities and in the processes followed by the NIH. And this has had an impact on scientists at every single level. There are plans now to reduce the number of autism centers of excellence that are mandated. These are mandated under the CARES Act. The plans are now in the coming year to reduce them from 9 to 6, which is a very significant reduction. And most importantly, the dissemination of false information with significant repercussions. The changes to the CDC page on the relationship between vaccines and autism, the FDA removal of the page on dangerous treatments, the announcements about Tylenol and circumcision causing autism, and that leucovorin would be an effective treatment. This was announced by the Secretary and the President back in September. And of course, the appointments in January to the I-ACC all of this has very significant impacts on the science. Is terrible. Some positive impacts. I will say some of the grants have been restored at the NIH. Some of them, the language had to be revised. In other cases, I think there was some political influence to reinstate some grants. The single positive impact was the Autism Data Science Initiative. There was $50 million announced in the request for application to investigate causes and monitor outcomes. We and others monitored closely the extremely flawed review process of those grants. But the good news is that they did fund 13 excellent applications. Although no summary statements were provided to any of the applicants at all. So not a single applicant, and there were more than 100 applications submitted, received any feedback at all. And then finally, the FDA walked back the recommendation that leucovorin's a treatment for autism, and that happened just a couple of weeks ago. So there are things that are happening. So what about moving forward for us in the scientific community? The independent committee, we have come together very quickly. We welcome all the feedback that we've received so far. I want to echo Allison's statements on that. In my view, a very strong foundation of autism research has been built over the past decades, thanks to the efforts of people at the NIH, like Dr. Itzel and Dr. Gordon, the private foundations. This is a strong foundation. And I think what we have is an opportunity now to plan for future directions that build on the major advances with new ideas, new technologies, and newer developments that are really going to make a difference in moving science forward and make a difference ultimately to the lives of autistic people and their families.
Of the 13 grants that were funded, did they fulfill the full 50 million, or is there still funding available?
I think they spent out the 50 million.
I also think it's important, they're not really grants, right? They're other transactions, so it's a slightly different mechanism. I don't know why. I
You're
feel
absolutely right. They do have different
funding
strings
mechanisms.
attached.
Yeah.
And we've heard nothing so far about the progress of the funded ADSI grants and what that process is, whether they've been collaborating as planned, how all of this is going down. We have not received any official notification from NIH.
So one way to look at the NIH funding is just total dollars. And in fact, Congress has for this year appropriated a slight increase, not a decrease. But OMB has asked for much of that to be forward funded, which means far fewer grants will be funded in any given year. And the success rate, which is often the measure we used to use at NIH to look at, are we doing a great job, has plummeted. At NCI, it's like 4%. It means that most grants have no chance of getting funded. Do we have a number for the success rate for autism grants?
I don't know
we
if we
track
have
that
any
over time?
updates on that. That's something that we could be monitoring.
It's a very, sorry, that's a very difficult thing to get outside of NIH because applications are not public information. So we can get access to the awarded grants and, search by autism. But without getting information from NIH itself, it's very difficult to know the number of applications.
Thank you, Lynn. maybe now that Dr. Gordon has joined us and is participating, could you go ahead and just introduce yourself so that everyone in the room and on the webinar is aware of your esteemed credentials?
All right, thanks. Yeah, I'm Joshua Gordon, the chair of psychiatry at Columbia. I'm a neuroscientist and psychiatrist. And for 8 years, from 2016 to 2024, I was director of the National Institute of Mental Health, and by virtue of that position, the chair of the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you. Okay, so next, Craig Snyder and Congressman Jim Greenwood are going to kick us off today by giving us some background and history on the Autism CARES Act.
Thank you, Allison. Thanks everybody for being here and being part of this. I've been advocating for federal efforts on autism, what we called in the law the expansion, intensification, and acceleration of federal research on autism for 30 years since I served as Chief of Staff to United States Senator Arlen Specter, who was at that time the chairman of the Appropriations Subcommittee that funds HHS and its components. 20 years ago, our autism advocacy community achieved its greatest victory with the passage of what was called the Combating Autism Act of 2006, the later renamed the Autism CARES Act, still in effect today with amendments most recently adopted in December of 2024. Among much else, this controlling statute created the I-ACC, the I-ACC, to, and I quote, coordinate all efforts within the Department of Health and Human Services concerning autism spectrum disorder. They gave the I-ACC duties under the Act, including to develop and annually update a summary of advances in autism spectrum disorder research related to the causes, prevention, treatment, early screening, diagnosis or rule out, intervention, and access to services and supports for individuals with autism spectrum disorder. It also required the I-ACC to develop and annually update a strategic plan for the conduct and the support of autism spectrum disorder research, including to propose budgetary requirements. Although the committee was not given authority in the law to control funds, it was given the responsibility to tell the world what the proper science should cost. The committee was chartered to include members representing government entities, the NIH, CDC, and other federal agencies that, quote, serve individuals with autism, and to include, at the time, the original bill, not fewer than 6 members or 1/3 of the total membership of non-federal public members to be appointed by the secretary, of which at least, again, in the original bill, 1 was to be an individual with a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, 1, at least a parent or legal guardian of an individual with autism spectrum disorder, and 1, at least a representative of a leading research, advocacy, or service organization for individuals on the spectrum. Those numbers of those 3 categories were subsequently changed to 3 in each of those categories. The I-ACC is required under the law to meet at the call of the chair or upon the request of the secretary, but not less than 2 times each year. And all meetings are required to be public and include appropriate time for questions and presentations by the public. So those are the statutory requirements of the government committee. So why are we here in what the media is calling a shadow I-ACC? Because on January 28th, Secretary Kennedy announced a complete reconstitution of the I-ACC, appointing 21 new members while excluding scientific and advocacy leadership that has historically guided the committee as required by law. The current committee has been stacked to reflect a narrow ideological agenda that does not embrace either the autism community in its full diversity or the state of autism science. It sidelines rigorous evidence-based inquiry and thus has great potential to stall scientific progress, to distort research priorities, and to squander very scarce taxpayer money, and ultimately, therefore, to harm people with autism and all those who love and support them. The new I-ACC includes no continuity from prior committees, no institutional memory, which is a first, and a striking absence of scientific expertise. It disproportionately represents the small subset of families who believe, contrary to scientific consensus, that vaccines cause autism, while excluding the overwhelming majority of autistic individuals, families, and advocates who support evidence-based science. Notably, none of the organizations represented on the committee fund autism research, and there is precious little range of viewpoints, the kind of range of viewpoints that's necessary to engage in meaningful discussion of scientific priorities. And I want to note again how this deviates from past practice when, for example, Allison Singer was seated next to RFK ally Lynn Redwood. The official I-ACC represents neither the autism community nor advances its interests. Instead, it undermines decades of progress towards evidence-based policymaking and risks reversing hard-won gains in autism research, services, and public trust in science. All of this not only undergirds the mandate for this independent movement, but all of it was recognized by Congress in the NIH Appropriations Act passed for the current fiscal year. Anticipating the Kennedy game plan, the FY26 Senate Appropriations Committee report, using unusually strong language, stated regarding the I-ACC, quote, "The committee directs that the secretary appoints experienced, leading, licensed, and board-certified researchers in the field of ASD." That legal direction from the Congress was promptly ignored by the secretary. And I want to quote the decision just handed down, I guess last week, by Federal District Court Judge Brian Murphy in his ruling staying the actions of Secretary Kennedy and his appointees with respect to vaccine policy. The court said, "There is a method to how these decisions historically have been made, a method scientific in nature and codified into law through procedural requirements. Unfortunately, the government has disregarded those methods and thereby undermined the integrity of its actions," end quote. Many of us present at the creation of the I-ACC 20 years ago hoped for very rapid and dramatic breakthroughs in science around autism. We hoped that by now we would have answered more completely the key questions about autism, and particularly ameliorated the suffering of those with profound autism. This hasn't happened, as the complexity of the scientific questions on autism has proven greater than perhaps the naive optimism that some of us at that time allowed us to imagine. Still, real progress has been made in science, and further progress depends entirely on an evidence-based allocation of resources. And so this committee, while it is a completely private entity and not required to follow the law for the official committee, this committee becomes crucial to continuing sound autism science in the United States and access to sound scientific information by the American people. As a non-scientist who has spent half of my life at this point working to fund, facilitate, and empower autism science, and still believes 100% in the promise of that science to save and improve lives, I wish this committee Godspeed. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Congressman Jim Greenwood.
Thank you, thank you. And I'll begin by expanding a little bit on my background, so you know, sense of how I find myself here this morning. I'm from Bucks County, Pennsylvania. In the 1970s, I was a house parent at the Woods Schools. I worked with children with intellectual and emotional disabilities. Later, I served as a caseworker for the County Children and Youth Services Agency, specializing in special needs children who had been abused or neglected. In both instances, many of my charges were on the autism spectrum. In 1980, when I was 28, I was frustrated with the insufficient state resources for these children. So I ran and was elected to the State House of Representatives and formed the Pennsylvania Legislative Children's Caucus. In 1992, after 12 years in the State House and the Senate, I was elected to Congress, where I continued my work in support of children. In 1998, Craig approached me and asked me if I would be interested in introducing legislation to expand services for people with autism. I enthusiastically agreed. Craig introduced me to John Shestak, who had created an organization called Cure Autism Now. John had a son, I believe his name is Doug. Yes. I remember John telling me at a certain age, young age, Doug just sort of withdrew from him and how sad for the parents. So the three of us, John and Craig and I, all hail from the Philadelphia area, and we worked together to develop the first legislation to create federal policy on the rising prevalence of autism. Shortly thereafter, I introduced the Pediatric Autism Research Advancement Act. The bill became Title I, a locomotive pulling forward a 27 title law called the Children's Health Act of 2000. When we spoke of autism in those days, we meant what is called profound autism, a serious debilitating medical condition, very often wrapped up with co-occurring physical morbidities, which cause great suffering. And with the continued absence of medical interventions, the statistics show that the profoundly autistic have far greater likelihood of a reduced quality of life and a shorter life than the general population. It was a time of great technological optimism owing to the Human Genome Project. We already knew that autism was the most heritable developmental disability, and we hoped and expected that science would quickly identify an autism gene and find a way to edit out the debilitating effects. But the fact that autism has proven more difficult to fully understand should only recommit our country to the efforts needed to do so. Shortly after I left Congress, the Combating Autism Act became law, and as Craig has described, the I-ACC created and embodied a federal policy to expand, accelerate, and institutionally rationalize large-scale, publicly funded scientific research on profound autism. Of course, decades later, we find ourselves with that official government body being a potential hindrance rather than the driver of scientific progress on autism and a source of misinformation on autism for the American people rather than the gold standard of scientific expertise. I have a grandson and a nephew on the spectrum, and I'm delighted to be a part of this independent effort to reassert and ensure scientific integrity in the autism research enterprise of our country, and it's launched today. Because even though scientific inquiry on autism has not yet produced the results for which I had hoped those many years ago, remains the only thing we can produce a true and lasting answer to the prayers of the families facing the struggles of loved ones with profound autism. Well, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a parent, but I think that I hope to contribute is because of my political background, some advice and counsel for the rest of you on how we might best communicate with elected and appointed public officials and public at large. Thank you.
Thank you both. So before we start on our main work today, which is hearing from all of the committee members about their ideas for building an autism research agenda, I want everyone to keep in mind as we're listening that in developing a strategic plan, we can choose to follow the federal I-ACC structure that has been in place since 2006, or we can create a brand new one. So the I-ACC strategic plan has always been based around 6 and later 7 questions, with the idea being that the plan would consist of scientists addressing questions as if they were posed by stakeholders. Now, the wording of these questions has changed over time to recognize new thinking about autism spectrum disorder, but in general, the structure of the plan has remained the same for the past 20 years. These are the questions from the latest strategic plan, which was published in 2023. They are: how can we improve identification of autism? What is the biology underlying autism? What are the genetic and environmental factors that contribute to autism and its co-occurring conditions? Which interventions will improve health and well-being? Which services and supports are needed to maximize health and well-being? How can we address the needs of people on the autism spectrum throughout their lifespan? And how do we expand and enhance autism research infrastructure systems to meet the needs of the autism community? The strategic plans have also always included several cross-cutting themes, and these have changed over time as gaps have emerged and as new evidence has come to light. These themes were designed to guide research priorities across all 7 areas. And so in the first year of the plan, 2009, the cross-cutting themes focused on prevention and environmental influences, ethical, legal, and social implications, heterogeneity of autism, community participation and self-determination, and translation of research into practice. In the 2012 update, we started to see the lifespan emerging as a stronger cross-cutting theme. So in addition to the lifespan perspective, the other cross-cutting themes were translation and implementation science, data sharing and research infrastructure, and the involvement of stakeholders. Okay. And then in the latest iteration of the strategic plan, which came out in 2023, there were 2 primary cross-cutting themes. These were supporting research into sex and gender differences and reducing disparities to promote equity across the spectrum. So these themes emphasized tailored interventions, diverse representation in studies, and the needs of underrepresented populations. So as this group starts to think about its new strategic plan, let's keep this also in mind, but keep in mind the structures of the past, but also be thinking about whether we want to completely overhaul the format of a plan and embrace a new framework, whether we want to include cross-cutting themes, update the cross-cutting themes as well. So as we move into the research priority presentations, I just want to remind everyone that our goal today is really to listen, to hear about options to build a strategic plan. I think we recognize that not every point of view is currently represented at this table. And as I said earlier, we will begin to address that in our discussions later this afternoon about adding additional points of view. So I guess in summary, I'll say today is the beginning. So the order of speaking was determined mostly by people's individual schedules. This committee came together in 6 short weeks, and we have some committee members who have clinical responsibilities and very tight travel schedules. And so we tried to create an agenda that worked around all of those parameters. So we're going to start this morning with the immediate past chair of the federal I-ACC, Dr. Josh Gordon.
Hi,
So Dr. You should be able to share your screen.
Yeah, I don't have any slides to present, but I really appreciate the opportunity to give you some thoughts about moving forward. And before I do that, let me just thank you, Allison, for bringing us together. It was as I said when you first raised this to me, this is a brilliant idea, and I've received lots of positive feedback from really diverse members of our community that we're doing this, and that's reflected in the public comments as well. So thank you for doing that, and thank you, Kelsey, and I think others as well for the support that enables the meeting to take place. And thank you, Mr. Snyder and Congressman Greenwood, for really clearly articulating the reasons behind the establishment of the federal I-ACC. Many of us on this call have served on that I-ACC and are familiar with its operations. But it's important that we remember why and how it was established and what it's supposed to be doing, because we want to make sure that to the extent that it is doing it, that in the future that we back that up, and to the extent that it's straying from its original mission, that we have the opportunity to shore up that mission and provide a more holistic view of the strategies we need to pursue in autism, both research and care. Before I comment specifically on the strategy questions, which I think are important to address, I want to just give you my 2 cents on what the I-ACC meant to me as chair and as NIMH director, and what its power is to remind us all that we have the opportunity to supplement the federal I-ACC and continue the work if the federal I-ACC is unable to do so. And I think, as the comments were made earlier, there are some grave concerns that the federal I-ACC will not be able to continue to do what its true mission is. First and foremost, for me as chair of that organization, the federal ICC raised issues to the fore by engaging with a broad group of stakeholders, but especially individuals with autism and the families that support them. In raising these issues, they identified areas that were deserving of greater investment, whether in research or in care, trouble points for the community, and that made a big difference. While the I-ACC never had the power to direct funding or to establish new programs by fiat, I can't underestimate the impact that the I-ACC had on me as NIMH director, on my staff, which came religiously to each and every one of those meetings, in terms of identifying new areas of research that were underrepresented within the NIMH portfolio. These, in the short term of my tenure as director, included programs to do research around transition age issues, aggression and violence, comorbidities, girls and women with autism, and really a host of other important aspects of the disorder. My fellow institute directors with other areas of purview also were influenced, whether that be the Child Health and Human Development, looking at intellectual disability issues, or the Institute on Deafness and Communication Disorders, which really expanded the research it was doing into assisted communication devices as a direct result of the issues raised in the federal I-ACC during my tenure. So the impact on the research sphere is considerable. And I did hear from colleagues on the federal I-ACC from various other agencies, including the Department of Labor and including CDC, that the impact on federal programs in their areas was similar. So there's one other purpose of the I-ACC that was hinted at, but not directly explicitly addressed by the comments others made earlier. But it was exemplified by the comment of having Allison sit next to Lynn Redwood. The I-ACC brings together, in the best case, the I-ACC, I should say, brought together individuals from various for lack of a better word, factions within the autism community, had them sit down at the table together and understand the different perspectives in a way that enabled collaboration and communication rather than division. I witnessed this firsthand and through two makeups of the I-ACC, where people sitting down at the table initially carry very strong views about the importance of self-determination for individuals with autism, focusing on the needs of people who have the capacity to work but have challenges in the workplace, focusing on individuals without the capacity to communicate, profound autism individuals who will need care throughout their lives. And each of those individuals felt that it was crucial that those issues be brought to the table as priorities. But each of those individuals also, through the course of the 3 to 4 annual meetings and discussions on the side, came to understand these different perspectives and were able to forge through documents like the research strategy, through documents like our annual reports on advances in autism science, they came to be able to understand each other and recognize that in such a large and heterogeneous community, working together was better than splintering. And I think what is at stake now, given the lack of such diverse representation amongst the federal members, is not only that there might be a skewed research strategy, but also that the federal I-ACC as composed has the potential to divide rather than unite the autism community. And I think that should be one of our goals, which is to counter that by inclusion rather than by division. I will say that we should not assume that the federal I-ACC as composed won't be able to accomplish its mission, but rather we should work hard to try to supplement it when it is not, and encourage the members of that group to think more broadly, whether it's by example of us thinking broadly and being inclusive, or by direction and explicit comments when it goes astray from that mission. There are members of that committee who might come from a given perspective, but are nonetheless open-minded and want to accomplish that mission. And if we can support them in that endeavor and help to some extent that group not go off the rails completely, we can also achieve our mission as the independent ACC. So what is at stake here? What is at stake is trying to keep this community together. It's also providing, as others have mentioned, clear communications about the real contributors to autism, about the real scientific opportunities, and making sure that we have a research strategy that is broad, appropriate, and supported by the science and addressing the needs of the entire autism community. All right, so now I'll make a few more comments about the research strategy task that we're engaged in. And as most of you know, I, unlike many of the members of this committee, I'm not an autism scientist myself, so I'll leave much of that subject matter to those who can speak to it better. But I would say that the federal research strategy, when last published, was one that was comprehensive, at least intended to be comprehensive. It was well thought out, and I think it would behoove us to, at the very least, start with that, especially given the fact that, we don't have the support of the NIMH Office of Autism Coordination, which does a lot of the heavy lifting of creating these reports. Given that, if we accept as a starting point that structure, I think it will help us accomplish our task. And updating that and making sure it's continues to be responsive to the need of the community, but also appropriately designed from a scientific perspective, and really taking advantages of the opportunities that have emerged in the last few years since the last research strategy update was created. I think that will serve us well and serve the community well. And then finally, as others mentioned, and certainly as is apparent from the public comments, broadening the circle of membership in this group is going to be really helpful in that. And I would suggest as well that in addition to turning our attention to that research strategy document and making sure that we update that from this broad perspective, that we also think of, with the help of our community, some areas that we might want to highlight as opportunities, like the previous I-ACC did, and bring in experts in those areas and bring in voices of lived experience in those areas so that we can explore those new opportunities. So hopefully I haven't gone on too long, and I've said my piece in terms of what I think we can do, and I really look forward to working with the group to do it. over the course of the next year. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gordon. You were perfectly on time. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Kelsey Martin from the Simons Foundation.
And I do have slides.
Yes.
All right, well, thank you all. I'm really delighted to be here. What I'm going to do today is really give sort of a history of autism research at the Simons Foundation, and then move to what our strategic priorities are. So, my view really is that we've been working over the last year to year and a half to really think about what can the Simons Foundation do. But part of that is very much influenced by where do we fit in the larger ecosystem of autism research funders. So for that reason, I'm very happy to be here. And I would just also add, like Josh, I'm not an autism researcher. I study the molecular cell biology of learning and memory. But honestly, some of my research has, because I think understanding neuroscience brings you to an understanding of brain development, has moved into that direction. So the foundation was established in 1994 by Jim and Marilyn Simons. Jim was a mathematician, fantastic a mathematician who then turned to use that mathematical expertise in finance, developed Renaissance technologies, and the Medallion Fund, became very wealthy. And with great vision and generosity, Jim and Marilyn set up the Simons Foundation that has a mission of advancing the frontiers of research in mathematics and in basic science. And it does that through grant making, through in-house research, and also through public engagement, a real commitment to bringing interest in basic science and math to the public. The foundation itself has two sort of divisions. One is a grant-making division. That's where the Simons Foundation initiative, Safari, that lives in the Autism and Neuroscience division. There's a Math and Physical Sciences grant-making division, a Life Sciences division that's focused on ecology and evolutionary biology, and then a division called Science, Society, and Culture, and that's really the public-facing division that has e-publications, including the transmitter that focuses on neuroscience and has a component called Spectrum that focuses on autism research. There's also an intramural part of the foundation that's increasingly important, and it has 5 computational, so completely, in science terms, dry lab centers in astrophysics and biology. The biology has a significant interest in genomics and genetics, in mathematics, in neuroscience, quantum physics, and it's all supported by a very strong scientific computing core. So the Autism and Neuroscience division that I oversee includes Safari, the Autism Research Initiative. That is an in perpetuity program at the foundation. And our mission, as I'll get to in a minute, has been revised to advance the basic science of autism and related neurodevelopmental disorders. Our partners are in the neuroscience collaborations for Safari, and that's a slightly different program. They're 10-year interdisciplinary multi-institution programs that are really focused on very fundamental questions about brain science. And then finally, and I've been at the foundation for 4.5 years, so it's very easy for me to sort of toot the foundation's horn, but it's from its beginning had a real commitment to open science. And so we have an informatics team that its mission really is to operationalize the commitment to open science, to make sure that the data, resources, biospecimens are available to qualified researchers. We also are very interested in making sure that we continue to support a pipeline of outstanding, diverse researchers, and so we support early career programs for undergraduates and also for postdocs to early faculty positions. And one of the goals there really is to make sure that people with different expertise come to the field of autism research. So Safari, the foundation was launched in 1994, but Safari was launched in 2006. Tom, you had a lot to do with that, as I've been told, a lot of input. We currently fund over 300 investigators. Yesterday, we finished our annual 2.5-day meeting. with, around 270 people in person, including everybody. So investigators, friends, other autism funders, and staff. But since the beginning, we've supported over 750 researchers. The annual budget is across autism and neuroscience. The largest component is in Safari. It's about $155 million a year. I always think that we have three major buckets of activity. One is convening, like the meeting that we just had, but we host a lot of workshops because we want to bring people in to share ideas, but also to consider new opportunities for investment. We do grant making to individuals, big interest in supporting collaborative projects because we think that greater advances are made when different perspectives bring their perspectives to investigate a problem. Again, early career programs, and we support two institutional programs, one at MIT and the Simon Center for the Social Brain, and the other in Edinburgh and Scotland on the Simons Initiative for the Developing Brain. And I think it's important to say also that we do support research locally. And then, one of my favorite parts, I guess I talked too much over the last 2.5 days. One of my favorite parts of the program is that we invest a lot in creating research-ready resources. So we support biorepositories, cohorts, and data, again, that's made available to qualified researchers. This is a really great article if anybody's interested in the founding of the Science Foundation that was written by the Science Philanthropy Alliance, and it really describes how in 2003 Jim and Marilyn Simons brought together researchers to really consider about how could they have impact in understanding autism with an aim to really improving quality of life. And they concluded at that time, one is that they wanted to bring more people in. They wanted to raise the talent in the autism research community. And the second was that genetics would be a fertile area for research. And at that time, I think that was a wise decision because again, around 2003, what was recognized is that autism was one of the most heritable neuropsychiatric disorders. And there are these numbers about if you're an identical twin with autism, the likelihood that your twin would also be autistic is somewhere between 70 to 90%. Fraternal twin, it's down to about 30%. Siblings, it's about 20%. Why is this important? It tells you that there's both genetic and environmental contributions. But at that time in history, the emergence of amazingly powerful technologies and tools in genetics made it really a ripe, opportune moment to invest in the genetics. And so that really, I think of as, I always have a problem. It's like anybody who's seen me at meetings literally.
We can advance.
Yeah, okay, that's perfect. Okay, so this goes back to sort of the origin story of Safari, where there was a very large investment in cohorts in gene discovery, and people in the room and on Zoom, like Matt State, were involved in this, developing a cohort called the Simon Simplex collection, had a simplex design. They're called quad families, a child with autism, an unaffected sibling, and unaffected parents. An incredible effort to standardize the collection of data and biospecimens. And then that coupled with unbiased genomic analysis and that commitment to open science, to sharing the data, really led to the discovery of a number of what are called de novo mutations. So genes that are in the children with autism, but not in others. And that then has led to, this is not today, this is 2023. And there was a presentation at our meeting a couple of days ago where the number went up to 253. But what was discovered is that there are a large number of what are called high confidence genes that contribute to autism, but they also contribute to related neurodevelopmental disorders. And the thing that's important is these individuals usually have one copy of that genetic variant. While it increases the odds ratio, so the likelihood that an individual would have autism or neurodevelopmental disorder, those are present in a very small percentage of individuals. So just to tell you, in one of our biggest cohorts, when we return results, it's about to 8% of those individuals. So it explains something, but it sure doesn't explain everything. So can you change the?
Yes.
So I'm just gonna ask
That
you.
one's correct.
Yeah, okay, oh, it was correct, okay, thank you. So we're continuing to invest in cohorts, and, and I want to say a moment when I said, our mission is on basic science of autism and, related neurodevelopmental disorders. I often get the response, people think that we work in animal models and in induced pluripotent stem cells, but our definition of basic science is really science that's focused on understanding basic mechanisms of biology, of behavior, of health. And this is a human condition, so we're very invested in studies in human populations. So SSC, that Simon Simplex collection, the original cohort, completed in 2011. The data is still available, biospecimens are still available. We get many requests and support lots of research that leverage that. We completed a study that we did jointly with the Nancy Lurie Marks Family Foundation called the Autism Inpatient Collection, which is a collection, a cohort of children in one of 6 inpatient hospital units. So these are more severely affected individuals, and we have genetic and significant clinical information. That data was released again publicly for qualified researchers last year. And the 2 ongoing cohorts, Simon Searchlight, is a genes first, so individuals with variants in those known genes that are associated with autism and other neurodevelopmental disorders can join that Simon Searchlight. We have over 7,000 individual carriers across 184 different groups. And then Spark is the largest cohort. We now have 440,000 participants. This is a phenotype first. Anybody with a professional diagnosis of autism is invited to join. They're invited to consent to give a saliva sample. We've moved, and we used to do whole exome sequencing. We've moved to doing whole genome sequencing. And this is an area of interest to us to really try to understand how that non-coding part of the genome contributes to autism. If you can move to the next one. So an important point I wanted to, a program that I wanted to highlight, we sponsor a program called Research Match, where we want to make sure that those cohorts are leveraged by other researchers. So individuals can apply if they have a study, and that is reviewed by both scientifically and by a community participant access committee. And if it's approved, we then reach out to Spark or Searchlight or SSC participants. And it tells you something that, like last year, we just completed 2 SSC. That ended in 2011. And when we reach out, people, the participants want to engage in those studies. So they can then opt in to engage in that study. The data then generates new findings, and we then release that again on our data repository database called Safari Base. And if you can go to the next study, an example of one of these studies that was organized centrally at Safari is one where we wanted to better understand sleep, an area of concern for many of the families in Spark. And this was done by Elon Dinstein while he was on sabbatical at Safari. And we sent 3 different digital devices, an actigraphy band, a wearable EEG headband, and a pad that goes under the mattress and senses pressure, along with an iPhone. All of the data was then streamed from that iPhone to the Simons Foundation. And we did this in 100 families where there was one affected teenager and an unaffected teenage sibling. And we did this over 2 to 3 week periods for each because we recognized we wanted to have a longer term reporting. And that data has now all been released on our data warehouse. But again, I think in the last maybe 3 months, 40 researchers asking for access to that to better understand sleep in autism. And the next slide, if you can just advance to the next one.
It's on that.
It's over there, okay. So I do, what I want to do here is that there, say that there are, this is an area that we are, okay, now there are two different ones, but that's okay. So there, we are really interested in, supporting more work, looking at sort of more quantitative and digital phenotyping using wearables and nearables. Why is that? More objective measures, continuous, a little bit, more passive, that people don't have to be attending to everything all the time. Real world, it can take place at their home or in their school. It can be inexpensive, not always, but inexpensive, and it's scalable, so we can get large numbers. And really importantly, and one of the, on the previous slide, the importance of the lifespan, it's longitudinal neurodevelopmental disorders. You want to understand the longitudinal nature. And we're very interested in trying to get measures that are closer to the core biology. And part of the reason for that is we know a lot about the genetics. And in the next slide is an example, really, superficial example here in the slide of a study that was done with our colleagues in the Flatiron intramural program at the Simons Foundation that took data from the SPARK cohort and did use what's called a mixture modeling method, a computational method, to decompose all of that phenotypic information and then look at the underlying genetic architecture, and found, like, kind of miraculously, that there were 4 different subtypes and they had different genetic mechanisms and different timing of those genetic mechanisms. To me, this is wonderful because the data that we had was not. It was fairly shallow. So were we to have more quantitative longitudinal data, I think the sky's the limit. And the next slide just gives you an example of the types of grants that we funded in the past year, because it does tell you a little bit about the areas that we're interested in. We have a collaboration that's trying to understand sex differences in autism, focusing on both genetics but also hormones. We do fund research and generate animal models to get at the underlying neurobiological mechanisms. These are really looking at monogenic syndromes, and one of them is in a rat model consortium. Rats are very social animals. They have large brains for reporting. So we funded a continuation of that. We're very interested in understanding the neurobiology of brain development, and so we started a collaboration that's linking early development to neural circuit outcomes, and that's an area that is collaborative with our neuroscience collaborations. And we funded a grant that gave support to people to analyze publicly available data sets to make more discoveries. We do provide support to patient advocacy group or family group meetings to bring research to those family meetings. And a really powerful mechanism of support was that we provided supplemental funds for safari investigators to actually go to a family meeting with the trainee, which I was incredibly impressed at the impact that had on people who had been studying, let's say, SCN2A for 10, 20 years and had never met an individual with the variant. I think it changed the way that they considered their research. We provide support for courses and conferences in autism. And again, early career, we have a program for postdoctoral fellows that brings them into their new faculty. Again, in this current funding environment, federal funding environment, I think that's profoundly important. And an undergraduate program that is aimed at undergraduates who are at institutions where they don't have opportunities to participate in research. And we pay for them to work throughout the year in the lab of a Safari funded investigator within a commuting circumference. That also has been very impactful. And I think almost at the end that, okay, so I just wanted to sort of summarize some of our values and principles. It's that really understanding the genomic architecture does provide a rigorous way of understanding autism biology and heterogeneity. Going forward, that quantitative phenotypic information is going to be critical to parsing that heterogeneity and elucidating the underlying genetics biology. And that we want to use this framework to sort of dig into the neurobiological mechanisms, that emphasis on basic science, but in our mind, it's to build the knowledge base for translational work that will make a difference in people's lives, And I didn't say this, but part of our very intentional approach in saying we're going to focus on basic science was really twofold. One was we looked at the whole ecosystem of other funders, for example, ARIA coming online with the more translational approach. And we said, well, how do we find a complementary approach in that larger ecosystem? And two, we thought about, we're at the Science Foundation, which is committed to basic science and math. So how do we really leverage who we are as part of the foundation? That bringing new talent and scientific ideas into the field will only benefit the field. And again, this real deep commitment to open science and data sharing that we continue, even, for example, working closely with 4 of the Autism Data Science Initiative grants that are using Spark for their research and figuring out how we manage that data sharing and also respect the privacy of all of our participants. Okay, thank you.
Let me make a quick comment.
Yeah.
The CARES Act authorizes autism research spending of approximately $300 million a year, going up by a couple million each year for 5 years. This one institution, the Science Foundation, has a budget of $155 million. And there are obviously other private funders. The key word in I-ACC is coordinating. And it defies all reason to think that the federal committee can do coordination of autism science in the absence of coordinating with the private funders, particularly when you look at the scale of private funding being a pretty big chunk of all the funding, given that the federal commitment has not gone up.
Agreed.
So Craig, the CARES Act authorizes 300 million?
Yes.
And they've only funded 50 million.
They claim that was from a different source. We don't really know.
No, they do invest.
Yes.
In other research grants on autism.
Right.
Now, I think we have from the I-ACC report of 2024.
Yeah.
I think the number is about 358 million, something like that, for NIH, or for federal, I should say, for all federal investment. But still, I mean, 155 is already now nearly 50% of that.
Right.
And that's one private source.
Exactly.
Science Foundation is a small government.
I know.
Okay, next we're going to hear from Dr. Zach Williams, who's on Zoom.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Let me just get my screen shared over here. Okay. All right, is everyone able to see my screen?
Yep.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. Hello, everyone. Zach Williams from UCLA. And I'm going to, for I guess the first time, be the autism scientist talking about autism research. And so, yeah, let me just jump in. So I guess, the first thing we want to ask in, any of these sorts of conversations is, what is the ultimate goal of doing autism research? And I think we would all agree is to improve the lives of autistic people. And to a lesser extent, the people around them, their communities, their caregivers, their support professionals, even clinicians who are working with them, etc. And how exactly are we going to do that? To start, I think that I like to look at this study, Roche et al. 2021, which did a review of autism research priorities and a whole bunch of stakeholder elicitation studies across countries. And boiling it down to the top 3 were pretty broad categories of one being skills development throughout the lifespans, things like developmental skills, daily living skills, employment skills, etc. Improving skill development through more interventions, more opportunities for that, all of those sorts of things. The second was physical and mental health, improving those, improving well-being through that, etc. And the third being better services across the lifespan. Again, better service access, better service provision, better expertise of service providers, all of those. So just keeping these 3 things in mind is very important in understanding where I'm coming from in providing these recommendations for future research. This isn't quite going to be as comprehensive as the previous I-ACC research agenda, which was expanded through all different fields of autism research. But I think this is still going to give you a good idea of where I think some of the research agenda should be focused. And where I do think that should be is in clinical research. I mean, one thing that is helpful in clinical research is there is always this area of proximal change that can be made, which is that if you have a clinical study, and it provides results that are, going to say, something can be done with these results, it is going to potentially change practice. There is a near-term impact that your clinical study can actually be changing lives via changes in healthcare. And that's meaningful. You're going to improve someone's health via improving the care they receive. Now, we don't actually have a lot going on in autism care. I don't know if people have seen, that ACAP last had an autism practice parameter in 2014. And if you read it, it doesn't actually seem very out of date. Not all that much has changed since 2014 in the sort of evidence base of autism treatments and child psychiatry. And I don't know that ACAP is actually planning on making an update right now. But this also says that in 12 years, we really haven't done much to update the practice parameters. And that itself is problematic. In addition, there are a lot of evidence gaps that still need to be filled. It's not that we can't do anything to update this parameter, it's just that we have not yet run these studies. I mean, there is really nothing there for adolescents and adults, autistic people with severe mental illness, autistic people with severe profound intellectual disabilities, and several other populations as well. I think something that's also important is that autism research shouldn't just focus on autism features in the clinical sense. Co-occurring conditions and symptoms are often just as important, and doing clinical studies on those is something that we should focus on. Things like co-occurring language impairment, epilepsy, things like sensory differences, which are part of core autism, anxiety, etc. And then equally important, when considering clinical research are, the sort of translational studies that could very easily change how clinical research is done. This could be things like measure development or translational work to develop biomarkers or assays that, improve the clinical trial methods. Now, what within clinical research should we focus on, though? I mean, running just a bunch of clinical trials can be itself quite wasteful. So I think the major question here, and this is sort of very broad, but it's what works for whom and how much, is how do we personalize our interventions to make sure that the people who should be getting them are getting them, and that we are giving them the right intervention. And specifically when it comes to behavioral interventions in autism, this is something we very much don't know. We have ABA mandates in all 50 states, and yet the idea of what hours to give people in what context is still a very open question. Ideas of which medications to offer people in which context is still a very open question. And I think there should be a lot more work going into intervention personalization in this population, which of course we know is very heterogeneous. Beyond that, I think we need to look into different designs as to how to do this. Most of the RCT literature, of course, is testing one intervention versus a placebo or treatment as usual type of intervention, but many of the designs that are needed to answer these kinds of questions are things like comparative effectiveness designs or add-on designs, where you add something to an existing regimen already. And these sorts of studies are clearly more informative to help clinical practice rather than just deciding that an intervention will in fact work in people who may not be kind of clinically representative of the population that you would in fact use that intervention in. Implementation studies or just using an implementation science framework is going to be very helpful as well. We don't know a lot about how our interventions work in real life settings. And this is also where I think most of the screening and diagnostic research should be used as well. Most of our workflow for especially early screening is quite well established. We don't necessarily need to spend too much time assessing the screening properties of new tools. I think we need to use the tools that we have in real life settings to maximize their effectiveness rather than their efficacy. And now I think we still, again, like I mentioned earlier, have lots of evidence gaps. Like, when it comes to behavioral or pharmacological treatments, adolescents and adults have, essentially case report level evidence for most things. And this is unacceptable. I mean, we really have this giant population of people who are getting substandard care because people have no idea what to do with them. And at the UCLA emergency department, we often have a young adult on the autism spectrum stuck with irritability and aggression in our care. And yet, I mean, the amount of evidence there is to actually treat that person with psychiatric medications is, again, with very, very low level evidence. It's a real shame, and we don't really think that investing in some sort of randomized clinical trials to figure out that person's care is helpful. I don't know. There are also non-evidence-based standards of care that get used all of the time, like using SSRIs for anxiety in autistic children. No trials. And so looking at whether or not there is an evidence base for those sorts of things seems like a reasonable investment as well, given that they are already used all the time in the community. And then lastly, I think including stakeholders in clinical trials, the design, the steering, selection of patient-reported outcomes is just good practice, and having this be more toward the standard, especially in large-scale clinical trials in the field, will help bring the field forward and make sure that things are more ecologically valid as well. Importantly, the clinical research that we do in this way does not have to be only clinical research. Other fields of intervention research can also benefit by being prioritized in this way. For instance, in the field of education, there are also trials that can be done to figure out intervention personalization that can also be done and prioritized because these are things that will impact autistic lives. There is intervention studies that are, again, looking at comparative effectiveness, and there will be an evidence base to look at best practices in education and so on that will be implemented and so on. The employment field also does this to a lesser extent. The studies tend to be less rigorous, but again, looking at autistic employment as a meaningful outcome that will help people's lives. The evidence base, I would say, is a lot more under construction, and the guidelines/best practices are not necessarily quite as evidence-based. But again, this employment subsector of research is something still worthy of investments. But looking at all of this, we will probably need to figure out a better way to do the research. In clinical trials, especially, multi-site collaborations are often needed to do the studies that are definitive. Most single-site trials are N of 30 pilot trials that don't necessarily tell you what you really need to know, and can't tell you when something fails. So leveraging multi-site collaboration networks, people who have already done trials together, will be necessary, as well as establishing large-scale collaboration networks. People like ARIA, for instance, is going to be the next step in how we do this big team science. And of course, I also think that this is going to be an opportunity once these networks are established to save the data and provide a lot of opportunities for secondary analyses like the other big trials do. Another kind of separate thing, but is related, is when we have rare disease groups. I mean, these are other consortia within the within the autism community that are often already in existence, but can be funded and directed money through autism research channels. These are a little kind of ancillary to autism research sometimes, but I think can be, I don't know, said to be a part of this group. And many of these disease states have quite a high prevalence of autism, and will use their can be applied to autism quite easily. And when we then look at these populations, the clinical studies will be more informative if you then build up the let's say the Rett group with money from autism research, and then potentially there is a return on investment from some targeted Rett study applying to the entire autism population. I do think this is probably better for bench to bedside research than using some similar method with a an idiopathic autism group, just because the mechanism of Rett is a lot better known, but it's also an open question as to whether or not those things do actually translate to autism. And then lastly, I think, outside of the clinical sphere, there is quite, a lot of other autism research that's still valuable. I don't want to discount basic science, more broadly, though I've focused on one thing here that's sort of epidemiology and health services that can still be a valuable adjunct to the clinical research that I have talked about. And one reason that that's so helpful is because it can impact autistic lives via policy change. The services landscape, is almost everyone knows here, I'm sure, is awful and fragmented and in need of a little bit more standardization, to say the least. And so a well done health services study can absolutely provide policymakers with the necessary fuel to make a meaningful change that can improve the way that services are delivered or administered. Um, and then lastly, there is also a place for things like descriptive epidemiology. The Adams study, which is of course quite expensive, is one of the most impactful studies in the entirety of autism research. Just the fact that we count the number of autistic people across sites has impacted the way that everyone here, I'm sure, thinks about autism. That autism is probably the most well-tracked psychiatric disorder of the entire DSM because of it. And this just pervades the field, this number of autistic people, not to mention all of the other phenotypic data that we collect through Adam. And so because we are able to have this descriptive epidemiology at the bedrock of our field, allows us to build a lot more clinical and translational work that can then be used for other purposes. So just to justify this and say that other extensions of this kind of work would be a good investment as well. So, the goal of all of this is to say that research is to improve the lives of autistic people. And, while I didn't nearly go into all of the work that could do that, I think that, focusing on the clinical or intervention focused work could definitely be a good start. Intervention trials that optimize, implement, fill evidence gaps, and incorporate community perspectives would be, kind of the way to optimize that area of work. Large consortia are going to be helpful for this, and we can also do right by our autistic people by helping to count them, look at health services, be a part of a broader kind of multimodal plan that also does more basic work in addition to the applied clinical stuff. Okay, and that is about all I got.
Thank you, Zach. Next, we're going to turn to Dr. David Mandel, who's also joining us on Zoom.
Oh, Josh on hand, maybe?
So yeah, Zach, if you can unshare and then David can share. There you go.
Zach, while David's setting up, Zach, I did have one quick question. You at the end mentioned counting as important, and there's a lot of controversies around the rates of autism and back and forth about the right way to look at the numbers of individuals with autism and therefore determine the needs. And I'm just wondering if you have anything more to say about that.
No, I mean that's a really good question, and I do think it's hard, right? Because at the moment we're sort of counting like diagnoses and educational classifications, and then the question probably is whether or not doing a thorough case review is going to save us any I don't know, validity. I mean, yeah, there's that one study from the CDC to say that it probably doesn't. If we ever went back to doing a more rigorous review, would it help? I'm not convinced that it would, but also I'm not sure if there are any like better methods out there to actually, be more valid in the meantime. But the case definition right now for Atom is not horrible. And I do think that as long as we keep it I don't know, the same over time, then it does give us some like comparator that's valuable.
Thanks for that, Zach.
All right, shall I start?
Please.
So I really appreciate going after Zach, and Zach, I really appreciate your thoughtful laying out of a research agenda really across the translational continuum. When I was putting this presentation together, I was thinking about that original I-ACC organization of first 6 and then 7 questions, and most of my expertise is in questions 6 and 7. About how do we scale up and sustain evidence-based care for autistic people and their caregivers. And so that's where I put the focus of my presentation in that kind of work. And I think why we have those 2 questions is that we have at least 2 fundamental challenges in improving outcomes at scale, even after we have interventions that we think of as efficacious. First is that autistic people don't have access to that care, and that access may be delayed or denied because of affordability, because there's not practitioners in their area, because the services aren't close to them, or that the services aren't organized in ways that people can use them, either by how they are delivered, the expectations of families, or even the hours that they're delivered. Even when they have access to that care, it's often of low quality. We now have a considerable body of research, 2 decades of research, showing that outcomes in the community are much worse than what we observe in clinical trials. And that may be in large part driven by the fact that fidelity to evidence-based care in those communities is really low. It is not consistent with the kinds of interventions we see implemented in university-based trials and then appearing in the literature. There is a third issue, which is that we are often making decisions in the absence of data about what works. We have many N of 1 trials going on trying to help autistic people. And I think there's a separate area of research that we need to explore in that, although I'm not going to touch on that too much now. So just some evidence for what I was just saying. Autistic adults and parents of autistic children report a lack of health care and poor quality of life. We know that better care is associated with coordination, engagement, and system integration, but those things rarely happen. We know that children don't get high quality or even any early intervention, despite the evidence suggesting its importance for both short and long-term outcomes, and that these challenges persist after early intervention throughout school. To Zach's point, we really do not have a lot of data on older adolescents and adults in this respect. As a result, those individuals often end up in the hospital, either for psychiatric or other reasons, or in the ED. And that system poorly serves autistic people as well. A recent study found that 20% of autistic people admitted to the hospital were readmitted within the next 30 days, that 30% had a relatively rapid repeat emergency department visit, that autistic people comprise 10% of psychiatric inpatients, but that most psychiatric facilities are not designed to meet the needs of autistic people, and that because of the very few options for discharging autistic people in crisis, they are 4 times more likely than other children to be boarded in the emergency room for more than 3 days while we wait to figure out where to put them. And sorry, the comparison group are other individuals who are admitted with a mental health diagnosis, a psychiatric diagnosis, as their primary diagnosis. So we see that behavioral needs and psychiatric needs are driving a lot of health service use, that there's substantial medical comorbidity, which we are not addressing well, and that systems failures in access to appropriate care and medical professional training are leading to poor care and poor outcomes for autistic people. There have been some efforts to address these challenges, and what I mean by that is trying to figure out what would work to solve it. A lot of them are quasi-experimental, and they're quasi-experimental because there are things at the population level that are really hard to run randomized trials on. Like, we are dependent in many ways on the decisions that local jurisdictions or states make, and then studying the effects of those decisions. So, for example, we see that in states that implement Medicaid waivers, there's a dramatic reduction in emergency room use for autistic people. We know that among Medicaid enrolled children, when we offer respite care to them, it reduces their risk of psychiatric hospitalization. And in commercial insurance, we see that increased use of outpatient services reduces hospitalization as well. There have also been many experimental studies. I looked at the last 20 years of randomized trials to improve service use and outcomes in autistic people. Overwhelmingly, the most studied intervention is care navigation. And that usually means a caregiver who has experience of these systems being trained to support other families in services. And we see that care navigation has substantial effects on improving diagnostic ascertainment, especially among poor families, increasing participation in early intervention, and reducing safety-threatening behaviors. So there's enough evidence for care navigation that we should be figuring out how to pay for it. We probably don't need another care navigation study, but care navigation is often a Band-Aid on a broken system. It often means that there's something fundamentally wrong with the system that we're using the care navigator to try and bridge. There have been other studies, and far fewer studies, looking at organizational directed implementation strategies to improve the use of evidence-based care for autistic individuals. And I want to point to one particular study that Lauren Brookman-Frazee and Aubin Stamer recently published in the Journal of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, showing that they could use relatively low-cost leadership interventions, so working with the leaders of either agencies or early intervention programs to improve fidelity to different interventions. So they tested these implementation strategies in multiple interventions in multiple settings for autistic children, showing that it improved fidelity to the intervention and child outcomes. And so we used to, when I was on the I-ACC, and I think afterwards too, identify publications that we thought of as really impactful for that year. And so I thought I would use this opportunity to do that here as well. This is one of my votes for one of those studies, the one that I just described. And you can see sort of the scale of what they're doing in 65 mental health programs with 387 providers, 385 children. For a community partnered study, this is really a huge undertaking, but really important to think about how we improve care and outcomes at scale. My second vote for impactful paper comes from Dr. Siegel, who did a study of specialized hospital psychiatric units for youth with neurodevelopmental disabilities who are overwhelmingly serving autistic adolescents. And showing that even in the absence of information, the absence of data about what models of care should look like for these folks, to Zach's point earlier, people are having to make decisions and develop programs based on best clinical judgment and based on sharing of information across these units about what services should look like. And so I think this paper does a really important job of drawing attention to this issue and pointing out an area where research really has to follow practice. We need to catch up with practice and think about what care for these really distressed youth should look like. So if I thought about what a research agenda within questions 6 and 7 should be, we have some fundamental things that we need to figure out, like how we measure intervention quality at scale. Usually we do it through observation. It's very intensive and expensive. And can we come to consensus on priority outcomes and measure them at scale as well? And I just want to point out Christina Nicolaides' efforts to do this for adults in primary care. And I think it really offers a model of how to do that for individuals with and without intellectual disability, what people value, and how we can measure that in a relatively straightforward and inexpensive way. Once we do that, we are really set up very nicely to study effectiveness of demonstrated efficacious interventions, what happens when we take them out of the lab and into the community. I also would advocate for getting rid of treatment as usual. I don't think it's a particularly useful comparison group, and we need to be comparing interventions to each other. I think we need a heavy focus on workforce preparation and in-service support for those folks and understand the best ways to do that in a way that improve outcomes. We need to be thinking about organizational incentives that increase evidence-based care, and how we ensure that care is coordinated across the multiple systems in which autistic people receive it. So again, to Zach's point earlier about the fact that most autistic children receive most of their care in schools, and yet we do not have the infrastructure that we do within the healthcare system to think about what the outcomes of those interventions are, or how they should be coordinated across the other systems. So I'm happy to make these slides available, but I think there are three areas in which we could profoundly move forward health services research in autism. One is causal modeling with existing data to examine effects of policy and services. When I did a review of looking just at mesh terms of autism and health services research, of the 510 more recent papers I found, about 9% use any kind of causal modeling. Almost all of them are descriptive. And so to push the field to say, how can we use these data to figure out what services are working for autistic children? I think we can use, many of those papers use claims data and increasingly EHR data. Cosmos is a wonderful repository of data from the EPIC EHR system that people are just starting to use for autism. There are also other data sets that exist, like the CDC ADAM network data, like Scandinavian registries, like SPARC and the Simon Simplex collection, that are traditionally not used for services research, but could set the stage for really important and impactful longitudinal research. We also need to be partnering with communities to test service models in use. And that was, again, one of the reasons I highlighted Dr. Siegel's paper, but thinking about the many published but untested models about integration with primary care, crisis services, hospital care models, and perhaps importantly, the proliferation of ABA services and what that is, and the quality of what they are delivering and what the outcomes are, and then strategies to test effectiveness and improve implementation of evidence-based care once we know something is efficacious. So, and these two areas, I think, testing service models in use and testing effectiveness and implementation, share a set of methods that are really important for us to develop in autism, especially developing pragmatic trial methods for large-scale effectiveness and implementation studies. The largest randomized trials in autism tend to be fewer than 200 individuals, and the median number in trials published in the last 2 decades is 48. Right? This does not allow for causal inference, and it does not allow for testing of heterogeneity of treatment effects, so we know that what works for whom. We need to think about strategies for larger trials. And I will just end by, Helen talked about the Autism Data Science Initiative funded grants. The call for those grants was to study services, outcomes, and cause. You can see from this map that most of the studies that were funded were about genes and environment and cause. There are 2 notable studies, one at UNC and one at Oregon Health Sciences University, that focus on outcomes. I would love to see how we can use these data that all of these folks are going to collect as a laboratory for longitudinal studies that allow us to understand the effects of various services, policies, and interventions on long-term outcomes for autistic people, and to begin to match and tailor appropriate interventions for individuals. I'll stop there.
David, that was really terrific, and I think you've given us a lot to think about. I really want to double click on your last comment about the importance of focusing on outcomes. And it makes me wonder whether, as we think about expanding this committee, we need to have people who are living in that world, which is not necessarily the academic world, but people who think very deeply about what do we pay for. I spend a lot of my time talking to payers, and autism is a pain point for most payers today. It was not 10 years ago, but today it really is. And what they say is, we don't see anybody looking at quality. We don't see anybody actually measuring outcomes. We don't really know what we're forking all this money over for and why we're doing that, except that it's required out of medical necessity. So I wonder whether it would make sense. I'd love your thoughts about this, to bring in somebody who actually represents that world to help us think about how does the science that we are supposed to coordinate actually get implemented? What would be the evidence that somebody would need to pay for a new diagnostic or a new therapeutic?
So that certainly is an area dear to my heart. I do want to make sure that what we do is consistent with the stated mission of the I-ACC, our independent group. We do need to change our name, I think. But I do think this issue, that the fundamental disconnect between what we measure in research and then what we measure in the community leads to some of that inaccessibility of services. And in the absence of clear quality metrics or clear outcomes, payers will often put up other roadblocks to stop. Like, we're going to require all sorts of prior authorization. We're going to require all sorts of accreditation of your staff. We are going to reduce our reimbursement rates until you show us there's a reason to do otherwise. And so I think this idea of coming to consensus on how we can implement quality measures, how we can measure outcomes in a meaningful way at scale, it is one of the directions in where there's a strong intersection between payers, community providers, and researchers.
Yeah, I just want to make sure we stay a little focused on this, because I think I would agree with everything you said in your first slides about the problems with both access and quality and the sort of dire state of care. But I just want to stress that we have incentivized exactly that. So we have a system that's built on fee for service, not on outcomes, not on quality. There's not a value-based care model that's really been developed, at least broadly. There's some tests of that in autism. But I think and this is probably something the other I-ACC, federal I-ACC may not do unless CMS is at the table. And even if they are at the table, but it seems like one of the places we could maybe be helpful is to try to lay out what that agenda looks like to move towards a value-based system for autism care, because that then does shift the quality conversation. It shifts the incentives, and you no longer have to worry about implementation science. You worry about effectiveness.
Question, which is, do you know of other areas, other conditions for which healthcare is provided? What's the model?
Yeah.
Okay, if it's not fee for service.
So Medicare Advantage was developed
Yeah.
to be value-based. And even in the mental health space, we now have the CCBHCs, which is a federal program, that are all based on prospective payments, basically a value-based system. So there are good models for this. We could do it here. There's actually a startup that is doing precisely that and showing its value. But you need the data, and the data need to be not just outcomes, but claims. So it's great to say that, we have higher ER utilization, but what people really want to know is, what does that cost? And what do you save by averting that? And then you begin to have the kind of conversation that payers can engage in.
One of the challenges with value-based care and behavioral health is that the epidemiology of behavioral health conditions is enormous compared to other kind of medical conditions. So in the city of Chicago, we can pretty much figure out how many docs we need and what it's going to cost to take care of the asthma patients or sickle cell patients in the city of Chicago. But the number of kids with developmental challenges and the number of kids with behavioral health challenges is enormous and almost unlimited. So when we begin to think about value-based contracting and we put ourselves at risk, we have to have a payment model that actually makes sense around incentivizing us to do that value-based care. But when the epidemiology is so big, the number of people who are affected and the dollar costs are so high, it's just a real challenge to kind of enter those contracts when you, in a way that makes it feel fair. So I am with you on that's really the solution, getting away from kind of fee for service and getting into value-based contracts, but the kind of contracting that we might do for some medical conditions, it's just a little bit different when you start moving into behavioral health. And right now, applied behavior analysis and other speech and language and a variety of other things through our value-based contracts are a good chunk really of what is applied. We also don't have very good line of sight in terms of what the diagnoses are, because some of that is proprietary to the insurers. So I love your idea of bringing payers to the table because they will have a lot of information about kind of what's going on. But getting to that data sometimes is difficult due to privacy concerns.
Yeah, just one last thing, and we should move on. So I know this is kind of a bit of a rabbit hole, but David gave us the hint about how to solve that. And that is, you can't just look at the behavioral health costs or the autism specific costs within behavior. You have to look at the total cost of care. And what you find when you do that, for instance, in the world of serious mental illness, they represent about 40% of the total cost of care looked at broadly. Maybe if you take out oncology, but everything else. And there are costs for people with schizophrenia, the costs are pulmonary, cardiovascular, diabetes. They're almost never behavioral health. It's the same thing here. When you start to get into this, you see that, it's the seizures, it's the whole series of other issues that are being seen in the emergency room, which may be behavioral, may not be, but that's what's really a lot of the drivers here. The problem for us so often is we carve out behavioral health. And so you don't have eyes on the total cost of care. So it's impossible to get the contracts you need in a carved out system because you're just looking at your silo, and your silo is a tiny fraction of the overall cost. So it is a bigger problem, but that's why I think having payers at the table have access to all the claims data. For the first time, you can get a picture of what are the total costs here and how can we, instead of asking people to spend more, how do we get them to spend less, but get better outcomes?
Okay, we do have to move on. Thank you, David. Our next presenter is Dr. Helen Tager-Flinsburg, who's here in the room.
Okay, so I want to begin by saying my background is in language acquisition. That's how I came into autism. Because many years ago, when I did enter the field, one of the prevailing theories at that time was that language itself was the underlying problem, and that was responsible for what we saw in social difficulties with social engagement, repetitive behaviors, and so forth. And so it seemed like this would be the exciting place to get into. And as someone interested in language acquisition, I really loved that idea. Unfortunately, for the most part, what we see in both research and in application in communication disorders is we do not look at language as communication in context. And it's always isolated. We test single words. We just train on single words. And and we do it isolated and without any context. I think we're finally at a moment, many years later, where we're beginning to move forward. So what we know now in terms of language in autism, of course, it went out of the DSM criteria, but in fact, there are still diagnostic impairments in conversational skill and in prosody. And we know that linguistic, and that cuts across the spectrum. And the linguistic ability, that is, in terms of articulation, words, grammar, is highly variable. all the way from the normal range down to the minimally or nonverbal people who never acquire much spoken language at all. This is the single best predictor of outcomes, and it's also the area that has the greatest impact on families. And I think we have failed enormously. I also think, and one of my interests in this area is that it's also a window into the biology. You can take it up into application, but you can also take it down. So in terms of advancing research, there's three areas that I think we're ready to move forward in. One is there are these acoustic or timing biomarkers that are associated with diagnostic symptoms. And I think we could really leverage some research in ways that would meet your definition of great phenotypic measures, Kelsey. I think we need to understand more about the biological mechanisms that underlie minimally or nonverbal autism. We've got to understand why these kids don't speak, and we have to then that's, I think, going to be a window into some possibilities for treatment. And then finally, we're not there yet. We are dependent, for the most part, for this population of minimally or nonverbal on alternative communication systems. And I think they are so limited. And I think it really doesn't take much imagination to, at least in the immediate term, look to develop more flexible and dynamic systems that people who are so severely impaired could use to be far more effective communicators. So in terms of vocal and timing biomarkers, there's lots of research now showing that there are these prosodic differences in pitch, speech rate, and pause length that are subtle, that and also other issues in terms of turn-taking timing that we see even in highly verbal people in conversation, topic development. We also know that, and this is really just one study, but I think a really exciting one, that there are differences in brain activation, the speech production in highly verbal children in the area called the supplementary motor area. And this is these are slides from David Mandel wanted to be sure we were going to be evidence-based. And so here are some of the citations for this. So we've got these clues now that are coming out of exciting research in this field. So what would be, some possibilities for a research agenda? Okay, people have always avoided research on language because it's laborious to collect and it's laborious to code. And I think we're beyond that now. Now we can take advantage of all the technologies that are available. And which can use automated methods to capture some of the timing and pitch differences. Let's just focus on naturalistic language samples. Forget all the tests and the experimental paradigms. What we need is naturalistic language, because it turns out there was a recent study that showed the less structured the conversation, the more you saw these pitch and timing differences, even in highly verbal people. So the less structured, the better. And I think we could come up with some composite, objective, quantitative measures. The challenge is the vocal system changes rapidly over age. We need this at all age levels, and we need this at all levels of disability. It's unlikely. I think there are more metrics here, but I think they're going to be somewhat different depending where you are in terms of age and spectrum. And I think we should capture that. And the reason I think we need to further explore brain activation. We haven't done this across ages, we haven't done this across levels, but I think there's some real possibilities here. We heard in the last couple of days at the Safari meeting about the cerebellum, and I was so excited to see that reignited. We had done a small scale, pitiful study many years ago, but I think now this is a possibility. But if we're going to capture ages and levels of disability, we're going to need to harness better brain technologies, because right now we're so limited, and people who are minimally verbal, well, we've been successful with EEG and we're successful with functional near infrared spectroscopy. We are not successful with the current MRI technologies. And so we've got to make some advances there. And I think I argue that we really should focus on these particular features that cut across, because I think that we have the possibilities of a translational model. The work of Michael Long at NYU with singing mice can give us some really exciting clues to underlying biology, including genetics, as well as clues to some of the developmental timing for when this all comes. Okay, minimally verbal children. We, to my shame, neglected this population for decades. And I want to interject here and say so much of where the research program that my lab has taken over the years has been so influenced by the opportunities and that were opened up by the NIH and by especially also private foundations, identifying the real gaps, and then my group and others having the opportunity to take advantage of that. And I would say mentally verbal autism was certainly one of them. We avoided it because we didn't have the tools. But what we have learned over the years from trying to understand why these kids don't speak is one, and it's a hugely heterogeneous population, but for some there's deficits in auditory processing. We identified this using ERP, event-related potentials, to look at their response to infrequent tones. And this was associated with how well they understood spoken language. So it was a tone signal, but it was correlated with language comprehension. There's so much we could do with that at this point. Severe impairments in speech or oral motor functioning. At least half this population, but it's very varied. And this just is to show you, this is what's called a vowel space, how distinct your vowels are, okay? In the top, you see quite distinct vowels from typical kids, from verbal kids, but down here, look how mushy, look how overlapping those circles are. It just means that their articulation, this is just the vowel space, but there's so much more we could do there. But here is an important clue as to what's going on in this population.
What is that?
I'm sorry?
What's being measured? What?
Vowel space. So it's taken from acoustic measurements, done very laboriously. We need automated tools to capture this. So what's a research agenda? We really need novel assessments of comprehension. We don't have any good ones now. We're still limited to the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test of the equivalent. And we need to investigate better auditory function and dysfunction in a much more comprehensive way. Looking at developmental timing and prediction, how early do we see these oral motor impairments? How early can we pick them up and see that we can predict impairments in oral motor functioning? Investigate the biological foundation both in terms of brain structure, white matter, and so forth, brain function, the genes. Do we have a translational model? Well, yeah, there are those FOX2P mice that showed clear deficits in ultrasonic vocalizations. And most importantly, I think we need to be moving into some novel therapies here. We should be taking far more advantage of perhaps as we understand more about the biology, neuromodulation, brain-computer interface. We need to be excited about where we could go for this population of mentally vulnerable. But in the meantime, we're stuck with alternative communication systems, and they really are limited. Okay, they're what we have. They're so much better than what we had maybe 2-3 decades ago, but they're functionally limited. And most importantly, I think they limit the lives of people who are minimally verbal. For the most part, they're static, they're decontextualized, and they basically are used to train people to request for different things. There's not much beyond that. And this is what I'm showing you here, state of the art. It doesn't take much imagination to think about a research agenda on newer alternative communication systems where we can enable independent communication via touch, via eye movements, brain-computer interface. And we can develop far better systems. I think we know from the work of Janice Light, she has done some pretty cool work here, where if instead of just having isolated pictures, you embed the words and the actions in the scenes, objects and actions in a personalized visual world to build the language to communicate. So you can imagine taking a child to their local park, and that's where they are. They're in that scene, and then they can communicate about what they're interested in, what they see. This is the child's specific bedroom, and you can have a conversation within that context or in the classroom. It doesn't take much imagination to think about, and it doesn't take that much in terms of new technology to embed this kind of thing. And I have no idea why we don't have companies investing in bringing alternative communication systems to the 21st century, because we don't have these parents look elsewhere. And while the hope is there for them that their child is being an independent communicator, they're not. And we're going to hear more from Amy about that. So I think these are all research agendas that are achievable in the near term. I think we need to advance the technologies for brain imaging, and I think NIH has so much they could provide us there. And the linguistic and acoustic analyses, the computational tools are there. They just need to be leveraged. Siri is really good, okay? But Siri doesn't understand kids. You know, anyone who has young kids around knows that their kids love to play with Siri because Siri is always misinterpreting what they say. Why don't we have the equivalent at all ages? And then, of course, when you're dealing with populations like the minimally verbal, we know that their vocal tracts, well, particularly their speech motor systems, lead to different acoustic outputs that should be achievable with the tools we have today. And let's have some far better. This was just my little pie in the sky idea of what we should do with alternative systems. It's not my area. There are far better creative solutions out there to enable communication for every autistic person until we get to the point where we can harness some more advances perhaps in the biology. So I think that's all I have to say. Thank you.
So I think that one of the things we need more clarity about is whether the impoverished communication that you say comes from current I-ACC devices results from a problem with the devices or is caused primarily by severe cognitive impairment in profoundly autistic people who use them. I will tell you that my son is 27 and he he can speak, and what he asks for, he mostly uses language to ask for things. He has a significant intellectual disability in addition to his autism, and he recites a lot of Sesame Street videos as well. But giving him, there's no system that we could give him. I think that his speech reflects what he's thinking about. And the problem is with his lack of abstract concepts and his cognitive impairment. So I think that we need to kind of address what percentage of the minimally nonverbal have these significant, severe cognitive impairments that are restricting their communication.
Okay, so absolutely, Amy. Certainly the vast majority do have severe intellectual disability. However, their language, their communication is more impaired than a person with it who has the same level of intellectual disability. Okay. And so you do have to take into consideration the overlay of the autism impairment on top of the intellectual disability. I do think early interventions or interventions that focus on some of the foundations of communication do make a difference. And I'm not saying we are ever going to turn a person with profound autism who is minimally verbal into someone who is speaking eloquently about space and history and all those kinds of ideas. But I think that there are ways of developing interventions and assistive communication devices in an integrated way that would increase their communication. That would take them to a level beyond what we see them being able to do with the current technologies.
I think you've laid out a great agenda for the startup community. This is just the kind of thing that when you start to talk about building devices, bringing in AI, natural language processing,
Yes.
that's a part of what we do. There are 5 companies doing local biomarkers today for depression, not all of which, but some of which have been quite successful. There's several doing brain-computer interface for working on speech specifically. No one is doing what you're talking about, which is actually a much more tractable problem.
This is very, I can't be.
So Helen, my question though is there a way to use this committee to get that to happen? How can we facilitate that through an independent coordinating effort?
Well, I think if we can influence the federal, the NIH did enter into partnerships, public-private partnerships. And some of that, I think, is what's needed. You've got to incentivize companies to invest in these populations. I actually think that sort of idea that I came up with for a second, that could be used across many different populations. It could be used, I think, quite well with the elderly population, just as effectively. I don't know. I would say that we need to implement a research agenda. I think NIDCD is beginning to do work in, I don't know what they're funding on I-ACC right now. But I think we need the technology companies involved with the scientists to get this to scale.
Yeah,
John?
Tom, I think, your question is a good one. And I think, vis-a-vis my earlier comment about perhaps having some sessions where we focus on specific issues, this one might be a good one to have. And maybe with your contacts or others' contacts with industry, we could have them come and have some folks with lived experience and have, Helen and others who've done the research, and just to see whether we, at the very least, couldn't convene and get interest from that perspective.
Yeah, I think that would be a really great use of this effort. And I think it's going to be critical to have someone like Helen providing the rigor and nuance and the understanding of what is the problem to be solved, because often people jump in and want to build a device because they know how to build a device without a really good feeling of, well, how is this actually going to work? And as you just explained to us, it's complicated, and there's a lot of variation in why people with autism don't speak or don't communicate. It goes in several directions. I think that needs to inform the effort, but I'm not sure that NIH funding itself will build a device that can scale and be used by tens of thousands of people who need it. Whereas industry can move quickly if they understand the problem and can build something, particularly with the tools we have today, and could solve it. And I think it would be a really interesting problem for a committee like this to say, all right, let's set that up. Let's at least incubate the idea and see how far we can get.
So maybe the idea is, as part of the creating the research agenda, is to have some segmentation, right, between sort of basic science research, clinical research, epidemiological research, and research that the interfaces with potential private sector partnerships. Okay, it's sort of the research that's most ripe for essentially commercialization, right?
Yeah, Craig, I think when the Combating Autism Act set up the I-ACC, we were in a different world.
Right.
It was a world that, as Allison said at the beginning, where virtually everything was federal government. Federal government's becoming a smaller and smaller player in this area, and in some parts of it, they're basically MIA, right? Yeah. They don't build products, at least not well. So I think this is a great time to actually think about, well, what would be the right convening, the right group that could actually start to solve some of these things. Federal, academic, certainly got to be key, but they're maybe not going to be the biggest,
right?
But they need to be a part of it. So I think this is a really interesting time to ask ourselves, what is the ideal composition? Who should be at the table? And now beginning to define an agenda, who's actually going to be able to address that?
And to think in terms of subcommittees, right, or task forces, right? So it doesn't, not every one of those stakeholders or potential stakeholders maybe needs to be at the table for the entire agenda, but for parts of it where it particularly fits.
This is such an awesome example. I just think you could easily define what this problem is and set out an agenda of how to solve it.
I have a really quick question. And it's sort of following up on Amy's, but it sounds to me like there's motor functioning issues and cognitive issues. And I assume they're gonna have different solutions, but maybe.
And auditory process.
And auditory process, great. And so do you expect that they will, is there a lot of overlap? So even with cognitive impairments, is there also motor?
There's, yes, it's hugely heterogeneous, and just think about overlapping circles. Some just have the auditory processing, and maybe the cognitive. It's just, you see every combination. There's no one explanation.
So I love this discussion, but I am told we are way behind on time.
Just jump in.
We are supposed to have supposed to break for lunch at 12:30. It's 12:25. So we're supposed to have two more presentations before lunch, but maybe we'll just cut it down to one. And so, Joe, why don't you do yours, and then we'll figure out how we're gonna make up some time.
Okay, thank you.
It's working on the other one.
Oh. It's working on
Oh,
one, but
there.
not the other.
There,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, I'm gonna do it.
So wait, what we, when you get close,
There you go.
Yes. These natural ones.
and can you put that in like presentation?
Presentation.
Okay, very good, thank you. I'll try to move this faster. The Autism Society, we're very proud to be part of this this distinguished group. We're a very different, I think, organization than what we've heard so far today. We're a very much a grassroots organization, national advocacy organization focused on improving quality of life across the spectrum, across the country. We have affiliates throughout the United States who are, grassroots and provide services that our national organization provides to our affiliates. Should I be pressing this green button or?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a PDF, so it might not be working. CJ.
Okay. So what we're all about is providing connections and feedback. And I think that's an area where we can be extremely valuable as part of this committee. We through our national network of affiliates, and also we have a panel of professional advisors. In fact, I think some of you may even serve on our panel of professional advisors. It's a really great organization of some of the greatest minds in the business. And if you're not part of it, if you're interested, and we'd love to have you on that panel. We also have a council of autistic advisors, so self-advocates who give us input on what their priorities are and how we can provide better value to self-advocates. And the chair of each of those panels serves on our board of directors as well. So we have a lot of great information that we can provide. We also have, I think we're one of the only organizations that has an information and referral helpline. We serve about 700,000 people a year through our affiliate network and our helpline. So we gather a lot of data and a lot of information from our community. And our mission and vision is all about connection. We create connections, and our vision is to create a world where everyone in the autism community is connected to the supports they need and when they need it. Okay, I'll breeze through this one because I think you all know these things. But from what we've learned over the years and how the prevalence of autism has just expanded, the fact that it's a spectrum disorder, the importance of early diagnosis, and also diagnostic gaps that we've talked about today, certainly the vaccines and such. We also there we go. So what we already know about autism and the fact that it's lifelong. So research needs to address all across the lifespan and across the full spectrum, the continuum of the spectrum. And we're now really just starting to reach the point of aging. people on the spectrum now are really, now they're getting to the point of seniors, since the Autism Society was founded in 1965. So we really need research that focuses across the whole lifespan and across the continuum of the whole spectrum. The Autism Society represents the full spectrum, and we're very focused on, you know, the support needs vary with people all across the spectrum. Whoops. I'm sorry. Can I go backwards with the red? Okay, we'll just stay with this. Where should we invest in new research? Again, aging. We would really recommend that we focus on the long-term needs of health, housing, and support needs. Especially, you know, things like housing. We just had a tragic event in Maryland last week where you know, a young person on the spectrum moved into a housing that was designed for a collaboration of people with intellectual disabilities as well as seniors and other affordable housing, and he was shot and killed by police. You know, those are the things that are just tragic, and you know, research like that into how can we prevent things like that from happening. Of course.
The slide. That's where you want.
No, I'm on this one. Can you go back to where I just was?
Yeah, where should we?
I'm sorry. Well, I'll just speak to it. In addition to aging, of course, profound autism, we're very committed to research involving people with the highest support needs. You know, my own son, of course, is very severely affected with profound autism, and we as an organization are committed to working with all organizations that support the autism community. Since I've been the CEO, which has only been 6 months, we've reached out to the Profound Autism Alliance, the NCSA, but also to ASAN. I've had a number of meetings and have developed a very strong working relationship with the president of ASAN, Colin Killick, and we're very focused on unifying the entire autism community. Caregiving, that's another area where I believe that it's really important that we research. You know, there are so many millions of unpaid caregivers. You know, people like my wonderful wife who, you know, gave up her career and you know, she complains all the time. If you look at her social security statement, it looks like she's just sat around, done nothing for 20 years. And you know, that's far from the case. Services and implementation, we talked about evidence-based science and so on. Okay, important questions where we really need answers. How can we better support the transition from school age into adulthood, that cliff that people fall off at age 21, and also employment issues. And I would also like to recommend that we research, in addition to employment, you know, day programs for you know, people that, you know, like my son, he goes to a day program that's a farm, and it's a wonderful program. It's you know, those type of opportunities are really not contemplated often in employment programs. So we need to keep people in mind that can contribute to society, but maybe in a different way. How can we better retain direct support professionals? That is crucial, and obviously that requires better funding. But you know, these people that are so instrumental need to be better supported. Thank you. And again, talking about supporting caregivers, the importance of 24/7 caregivers. It's exhausting to, for parents, and parents are aging. It's not just the population, but what's good. Our worst fears, of course, are what is going to happen when we're no longer here. To be able to provide for our children, sustainability, and working on policy, and again being adequate compensation for professional caregivers. How can research deliver real life benefits? We need to continue to promote acceptance, and that's one of the things, of course, that the Autism Society is very focused on, in addition to awareness, but also supporting communications needs, like Helen just talked about. My son uses an iPad, and I must buy 10 of them a year because he, they're like disposable, and how can we provide better communication supports for people, and better alternative devices. He's totally nonverbal, and he'll press, if he wants to go to Red Robin, his favorite restaurant, he'll press Red Robin about 300 times, and so how can we accomplish some of the things Helen talked about? We would totally agree with that, and as well as programs that focus on safety, and first responder training, like we talked about before. And so some of the top opportunities we think for private funders, research that includes autistic individuals. We know that Dr. Zach Williams is on this committee, and when we get to that section of the agenda today, we have some other ideas or suggestions to include other autistic individuals who can work with these research projects. Research regarding sensory processing. Again, programs focused on profound autism. Caregivers, I talked about, community-based services, supporting nonprofit service providers, and society adaptation. So all these different types of equipment and that are needed for individuals to thrive. And lastly, as I mentioned before, we are very focused on unifying the autism community. That's a big priority for me. I've been involved with the Autism Society a long time, and I think sometimes we're our own worst enemy in that that obviously there's a lot of different perspectives and viewpoints, and we're not always going to agree, but we should be respectful across the organizations and be able to find common ground. So my colleague here, Delancey Allred, has formed an organization that we're calling the NAO, National Autism Organization, and we see that as a complementary organization to this I-ACC. And the NAO has brought together a whole diverse group of autism organizations. Our first meeting, it was a remarkable, I think, group that we had the Autism Science Foundation and the NCSA and ASAN and the Autism Society and Autism Speaks all came together for the meeting. And we talked about how can we identify intellectual capital to share with each other and share information. And I think that that organization can be a conduit with this organization, so we can communicate what the priorities are from a research standpoint throughout the community. So I think that pretty much brings me to the end. Thank you.